I'm Joe Graydon.
And I'm Terry Graydon. Welcome to this podcast of the People's Pharmacy.
You can find previous podcasts and more information on a range of health topics at peoplespharmacy.com. When people have near-death experiences, they often undergo a profound transformation. How is that possible? This is the People's Pharmacy with Terry and Joe Graydon.
Dr. Bruce Grayson is a renowned psychiatrist who has worked at some of the most prestigious universities in the country. He's taken a scientific approach to the study of near-death experiences for the last 4 decades.
What do people say about their experiences after they're revived? Are there common features?
Some people offer accurate reports of things they could not possibly have witnessed. Is there an explanation?
Coming up on the People's Pharmacy, how near-death experiences transform people's lives.
In the People's Pharmacy health headlines, public health experts are increasingly worried about a coronavirus variant originally identified in Brazil, known as P1. It accounted for more than 2/5 of the COVID cases in Manaus in December. This Amazonian city had already seen significant COVID-19 infections last year. Some of the people infected with P1 had already recovered from infection with the original SARS-CoV-2 strain. Public health experts are concerned because P1 appears to be more contagious and possibly more deadly, as well as able to evade antibody defenses. Manaus ran out of oxygen and Brazil is in trouble. But the variant has not stayed in Brazil. P1 has been identified in dozens of countries, including the U.S. It remains to be seen whether any of the available vaccines will defend us against this new variant.
Many people around the world are fed up with restricted activities, masks, and quarantines. Everyone wants to get back to normal. But Sweden may be an example of why it's too early to let down our guard. If you recall, Sweden followed a different course from its Nordic neighbors last year. Instead of a lockdown, public health authorities urged prudence. People were allowed to go to restaurants, bars, and outdoor events. Then Sweden was hit with a second wave that was much worse than its neighbors. Now, Sweden appears to be entering a third wave. New cases have increased by 10% for each of the last 3 weeks, and ICUs are once again under stress. The government has instituted reduced hours for gathering places like bars, cafes, and restaurants. Face mask requirements have also been upgraded, along with recommendations about working from home and socializing with limited numbers of people. Those who develop symptoms are being encouraged to get tested and isolate themselves. The National Public Health Agency warns that they may need to impose even stiffer restrictions if Swedes don't follow recommended guidelines.
An unexpected consequence of COVID vaccination may be false positive mammograms. Radiologists are reporting swollen lymph nodes in the armpit that are triggering concern during a routine mammography. In normal times, such axillary adenopathy would trigger a breast biopsy. But both the Moderna and the Pfizer vaccines can cause swollen lymph nodes on the same side as the vaccination. Radiologists are now recommending follow-up mammograms for many women with these findings, rather than an immediate biopsy. Mammogram centers are exceptionally busy right now, as many women who would have had scheduled screenings last year opted to delay them due to the pandemic. The Society of Breast Imaging now recommends that women get their mammograms prior to vaccination if possible. If they've already been vaccinated, the Society suggests waiting 4 to 6 weeks after the second dose for a routine mammogram.
Diet affects longevity. That's the conclusion of a new Harvard study published in the journal Circulation. Researchers collected data from the Nurses' Health Study and the Health Professionals' Follow-Up Study. Over 100,000 adults were tracked for as many as 3 decades. The participants filled out questionnaires on their diets every few years. In this analysis, the investigators focused primarily on fruits and vegetables. They also considered data from 26 other international studies involving nearly 2 million people. People who consumed roughly 5 servings of produce daily were least likely to die during the study. The greatest benefits seemed to come from 3 servings of veggies and 2 servings of fruit daily.
A new study shows that older women benefit from following a diet based more on plants. The researchers analyzed data from the Women's Health Initiative, which recruited more than 100,000 volunteers between 50 and 79 during the mid-1990s. These women filled out detailed questionnaires about their diets. During the 2 decades the study lasted, 25,976 women died. Those who reported eating more plant protein were 9% less likely to die than those who ate the least. And that's the health news from the People's Pharmacy this week.
Welcome to the People's Pharmacy. I'm Joe Graydon.
And I'm Terry Graydon.
Have you ever had a close brush with death? A surprising number of people have, and they say that a near-death experience changes their lives instantly and forever.
People who have not had such an experience are often skeptical. They may dismiss the report as a hallucination or hypoxia. Is it possible to study near-death experiences in a scientific manner? Are there commonalities in the experiences people report around the world and over time?
Our guest has been studying these phenomena for more than 4 decades. He approached them as a skeptical scientist and gathered objective data from over 700 experiencers. Dr. Bruce Greyson is Professor Emeritus of Psychiatry and Neurobehavioral Sciences at the University of Virginia School of Medicine. He served on the medical school faculty at the universities of Michigan, Connecticut, and Virginia. His award-winning research led him to become a distinguished life fellow of the American Psychiatric Association. He is the author of After. A doctor explores what near-death experiences reveal about life and beyond. It's the culmination of nearly half a century of Dr. Greyson's scientific research.
Welcome back to the People's Pharmacy, Dr. Bruce Greyson.
Well, thank you, Terry. I'm delighted to talk with you again.
Dr. Greyson, how in the world did you get interested in near-death experiences?
Well, it took me by surprise, actually. I started off as a diehard materialist. That's how I was raised. I went through college and medical school with a materialist mindset. And then a few months into my psychiatric training, I was confronted by a patient in the emergency room who was unconscious. And I talked with her roommate to get what was going on with her and arranged to see her the next day in the intensive care unit when she woke up. When she woke up the next morning, I introduced myself and she said, "I recognize you from last night. I know who you are." Well, that kind of stunned me because I couldn't imagine. So I said, "You mean the nurses told you that I was there?" And I said, No. I was unconscious in my room, but I saw you talking to my roommate in another room down the hall. And then she told me all about the conversation I had with the roommate, including what we were wearing, where we were sitting, and so forth. And it just blew my mind. I couldn't imagine how that could be. As far as I could tell, that was impossible. She must have been playing a trick of some kind. So I kind of tried not to think about it for a while.
Well, let me ask you to pause for a second, because this patient, you called her Holly in the book.
Yes.
Talked about a spaghetti stain on your tie. Could you explain that, please?
Sure. I was eating dinner in the hospital cafeteria when my pager went off to tell me there was a patient in the emergency room. And, that was a few weeks into my residency then, and I was kind of startled by the pager going off, so I kind of dropped my fork and spilled some spaghetti sauce on my tie. So I covered it up with my lab coat so no one would see it. And then went down to the emergency room and saw her, and she was unconscious, and then went down to the other room to talk to her roommate. which was a very hot room. This was no air conditioning back in the 70s. And I ended up unbuttoning my lab coat so I could not sweat so much, exposing my stain. And that was the stain that this patient, Holly, saw, which kind of convinced me that this wasn't a trick they had set up in advance, because there's no way she could have known about that.
And nobody else, actually, besides the roommate, had seen the stain.
That's right. That's right.
Why did that have such a profound impact on you?
Well, the only way she could have seen that is if she had left her body and followed me down to the other room. And that made no sense to me. As far as I could tell, I was my body. And the idea of leaving your body just was incomprehensible.
Now, Dr. Grayson, that's the first story you heard from a patient saying that they had had an out-of-body experience.
Right.
But it wasn't the last. Tell us about another one, please.
Well, there were many. The most dramatic one that I can recall was a 55-year-old truck driver who had quadruple bypass surgery, and during the surgery he claimed to have left his body and watched the operation and saw his surgeon, as he put it, flapping his arms as if he was trying to fly. Now, at that point, I had been a doctor for maybe 30 years, and I had never seen or heard of anything like this. I couldn't imagine that it was real. I thought he was hallucinating. But he insisted that he actually saw it. So with his permission, I talked to his doctor, and his doctor actually confirmed that. He said that he had developed this idiosyncratic habit, which I've never seen any other doctor do, and he hadn't either. He scrubs and gets his gowns and gloves on and walks into the operating room after his assistants have already started the procedure. And they've opened up his chest, and he's standing there, and he doesn't want to touch anything with his hands that's not in the sterile field. So he puts his palms flat against his chest and then points things out to his assistants with his elbows instead of his fingers so he won't touch anything. And it looks for all the world like he's flapping his arms. And there's no way that the patient could have known about this. It's a bizarre thing that I've never seen any other doctor do.
So these two cases, and I suspect many more, suggest to you that people see things, people hear things that they can't possibly see or hear if they're in a coma, if they're unconscious, if they're quote unquote cardiac arrest, near death. How in the world do you explain this?
Well, actually, the visual events are more important than the things they hear, because there are some arguments that people can hear under deep anesthesia on occasion, but there's no way they can see when they're anesthetized and their eyes are shut and often taped shut during an operation. And as you mentioned, this happens in cardiac arrest sometimes, and we know that in cardiac arrest, within less than 20 seconds, the brain waves go completely flat, meaning there's no brain activity going on at all. So it's hard to imagine how people can have elaborate thinking and perceptions when there's no brain activity. The only explanation seems to be that the mind is not part of the brain or produced by the brain, and that the mind can continue to function when the brain does not.
Now, I'm sure that is a pretty contentious argument, and we're going to come back to it. But first, we're talking about near-death experiences. That's the topic of your book, After. I wonder if you could explain to us just what is a near-death experience.
A near-death experience is something that happens to many people when they are in a near-death situation, or sometimes when they're actually pronounced dead, that has very elaborate aspects to it. People often feel that they leave their bodies, that they encounter other beings that aren't physically present. Sometimes these are deceased friends and relatives. Sometimes they seem to be deities or unidentifiable beings. They often go through a life review. Their whole life flashes before them. They seem to be in some other unearthly world, not part of the physical world. And at some point, they either decide to come back to their bodies or are forced to come back against their will. And for me as a psychiatrist, as striking as some of these experiences are, what's more impressive are the after effects. These experiences have profound changes in people's attitudes, beliefs, values, and behavior. And I've now been able to follow some of these people for decades, and the after effects do not go away.
Can you explain to us what type of after effects you're describing?
Sure. In gross terms, you can say that people become less materialistic and more spiritually oriented. And by that I mean they care much less about material possessions, power, prestige, fame, competition, worldly things, and much more interested in interpersonal relations, how they relate to other people. They become much more caring, much more compassionate, much more altruistic. They also almost universally have a marked decrease or a complete loss of any fear of death or dying.
Now, Dr. Grayson, you're not the first researcher to look into this phenomenon called near-death experiences, but I wonder, how many people have you studied, and for how long have you been at this?
Well, the patient you mentioned the first my contact was around 1970, and I kind of was uncomfortable with that and tried not to think about it, not very successfully, for about 5 years until I met Dr. Raymond Moody, who wrote a book in which he used the term near-death experiences to describe these phenomena. And in talking to Dr. Moody and in reading his book, I realized that this is not just one bizarre thing my patient had said, but it's part of a larger phenomenon that is quite common. This has been going on for centuries. There are reports from ancient Greece and Rome which are virtually identical to near-death experiences that we hear these days. There was actually,
so it's not culture-bound then?
It is not. It is not. We have this from cultures all over the world and all through time. There are some cultural variations in how people interpret what happens to them, but the bare phenomenology, what they actually experience, is the same.
And how many people have you talked to? You call them experiencers.
Yes. In my research, I include a little more than 1,000 people. There are many more that I've talked to that I haven't included in the research because I don't have enough information about them and their medical crises.
Dr. Grayson, why is it important that you have information about their medical crisis?
Well, there are arguments that these are fantasies or hallucinations. And I think if we can tie these experiences to a real true near-death situation, they become much harder to explain and to wish away.
You're listening to Dr. Bruce Grayson. He's Professor Emeritus of Psychiatry and Neurobehavioral Sciences at the University of Virginia School of Medicine. He served on medical school faculties at the Universities of Michigan, Connecticut, and Virginia. His award-winning research led him to become a distinguished Life Fellow of the American Psychiatric Association. He's author of After, A Doctor Explores What Near-Death Experiences Reveal About Life and Beyond. It's the culmination of nearly half a century of Dr. Grayson's scientific research.
After the break, learn how you can actually study near-death experiences in a scientific manner.
Many scientists are skeptical about these reports. How do they explain them?
How could you determine whether or not these perceptions are hallucinations or the result of oxygen deprivation in the brain?
When people talk about what happened in the hospital while they were temporarily dead, how accurate are their accounts?
If the brain isn't functioning, how can consciousness continue?
One hypothesis is that the brain acts as a filter.
What are the commonalities of near-death experiences, and what are the more subjective aspects?
You're listening to The People's Pharmacy with Joe and Terry Graydon. The People's Pharmacy podcast is supported in part by CocoVia Memory Plus. CocoVia cocoflavanols support both cardiovascular health and cognitive function by promoting healthy blood flow, transporting oxygen and nutrients to vital organs and muscles, including your heart and brain.
CocoVia Memory Plus has 750 milligrams of cocoflavanols, the plant-based nutrients from fresh cocoa that have been proven to help boost memory.
CocoVia Memory Plus is backed by 4 clinical trials that demonstrate improvement in 3 different aspects of memory: long-term memory, spatial memory, and word recall. The studies show improved brain function in just 8 weeks.
You can try the benefits of CocoVia Memory Plus with a 25% discount off your first month. Use the code PEOPLES25. To get the full benefits, take it daily for 8 weeks. CocoVia is offering People's Pharmacy podcast listeners a 10% discount on subscriptions. That code is PEOPLES10. Learn more at cocovia.com.
Welcome back to the People's Pharmacy. I'm Terry Graydon.
And I'm Joe Graydon.
The People's Pharmacy is brought to you in part by CocoVia Memory Plus, a cocoflavanol supplement backed by 4 clinical studies that show significant improvement in 3 different aspects of memory. More information at cocovia.com.
Also by Verazana, an analytical laboratory providing home health tests for hormones, gut health, and the microbiome, now with an annual health club plan. Online at verisana.com.
Today we're discussing how near-death experiences transform people's lives.
Our guest is Dr. Bruce Greyson, Professor Emeritus of Psychiatry and Neurobehavioral Sciences at the UVA School of Medicine. He's the author of After. A doctor explores what near-death experiences reveal about life and beyond. It's the culmination of nearly half a century of Dr. Greyson's scientific research.
Dr. Greyson, I imagine that you have encountered a certain amount of skepticism from your colleagues, if not outright hostility in some instances. Can you actually study near-death experiences in a scientific manner?
We can, but we need to clarify what scientific means. Some people assume that means doing double-blind controlled experiments. And while that's one way of getting information, it's not the only thing that makes a study scientific. There are many fields where you cannot do such experiments, such as astronomy, archaeology, and so forth. You're just confronted with the phenomena, and you have to study it in a rigorous way. And that's what we do with things like near-death experiences, or in fact, any personal experience, subjective experience. You can't do experiments to create them or not, but you can study what is there. And they're scientific in the way that we study them, in the rigor and comparing patterns across people, across cultures, across times, and then verifying the details of what people claim to have seen and heard during the experience.
Dr. Greyson, a lot of skeptics will say, well, these are fantasies. This is oxygen deprivation of the brain. These are hallucinations, some kind of brain chemistry change, or the person just made it up, fabrication. How do you respond to them?
Of course. Well, there have been a lot of physiological theories that have been proposed to explain away near-death experiences. And when we actually look at the data, each one of these theories seems to be disproven. For example, the idea that this is oxygen deprivation. We know what oxygen deprivation does to people. It makes them frightened, belligerent, agitated, confused, which is not at all like the calm, peaceful near-death experience. Furthermore, there have now been studies done in both the U.S. and in the U.K. documenting the oxygen levels of people in near-death situations, such as cardiac arrest. And what we find is that those who have near-death experiences actually have more oxygen going to the brain than people who don't report NDEs. And it's the same way with people who are given drugs. The more drugs you're given in a near-death situation, the less likely you are to have a near-death experience, and so on. We've done studies for almost all of the physiological measures that can be measured. Some, of course, can't be. They're just theoretical. And we have never found data to support any of these theories. Furthermore, there are things about the NDE that cannot be explained as hallucinations. For example, the accurate perceptions that people have when they claim to have left their bodies. Hallucinations do not produce the accurate perceptions.
We've already talked about, for example, the fact that your patient, Holly, knew that you had a spaghetti stain on your tie, although she was completely unconscious, and I'm assuming in very bad shape if she had a near-death experience at the time that you saw her. Are there other examples of accurate perceptions that people shouldn't have been able to know?
There are a great number of these. One patient that I interviewed had an out-of-body experience during an operation when she was completely anesthetized in a near-death state. And she left her body and not only observed what was going on in the room, but went down the hall to where her mother was in the waiting room and saw her mother smoking a cigarette. And that startled her because her mother was a non-smoker. Later, we talked to the mother about it, and the mother admitted that she was so nervous about her daughter's operation that she borrowed a cigarette from someone just to smoke it to see what it felt like. And in fact, that's what the patient saw. We have other patients that left their bodies during operations and were startled by the behavior of some of the surgeons. One patient, she heard them swearing at each other and arguing about the treatment. And she was confronting them about it. And after she woke up, and they acknowledged that this is all what happened. There have been a number of studies now where people have looked at large numbers of these cases. Dr. Jan Holden at the University of North Texas studied almost 100 cases of these, and she found that in 92%, they were completely accurate. In 6%, they were sort of accurate but had some errors in them, and only 1% was completely inaccurate.
Is that why you say that near-death experiences actually are real rather than, something that people make up?
Well, I don't see how we can deny that they are real. Dr. Mike Sabom here in the U.S. and Penny Sartori in the U.K. have both done research where they have taken every patient that they personally worked on who had a cardiac arrest and asked them after they were revived to describe the operation that was going on to resuscitate them. And those that had near-death experiences never made a single mistake, whereas those who did not have near-death experiences invariably made major mistakes about who was present, what they were doing, and what the equipment was like.
Dr. Grayson, several years ago, we interviewed a woman by the name of Pam Reynolds,
yes,
a singer, and she had a very strange neurological problem, an aneurysm that was in a very bad place in her brain.
Right.
Are you familiar with the Pam Reynolds story, and can you tell us what she observed while, in theory, she was absolutely dead? That is to say, no brainwave activity whatsoever?
Right. What's striking? There are a couple of things striking about this situation, and one is that in order to cut out this aneurysm, which was in the deep part of her brain, they had to drain all the blood from her body so she wouldn't bleed to death during the operation because the aneurysm would burst. To do that, they had to cool her body down to 60 degrees Fahrenheit to stop her brain from collapsing during the long operation, because colder temperatures eliminate the metabolic demands on the body. And then they tilted her body so that all the blood would drain out into a collecting pit. And when her body was totally drained of all the blood, then they were able to operate on her. They were measuring her brain activity by molded speakers placed into her ears that beat very loud clicks, sort of like sitting next to an orchestra. And when the clicks stopped producing any response at all in the brain, they knew that she was totally unconscious and not having any brain activity at all. So then they proceeded to do the operation. Her heart actually stopped during the operation. They had to resuscitate her. So the operation took longer than they thought. And while she was unconscious and her brain had no activity, she saw and heard many things in the operation, including the appearance of a very unusual saw they used to cut through her skull, which she described as looking to her like an electric toothbrush. And she had never seen this thing before. In fact, I hadn't either. And later, it turned out that her description was precisely accurate, including other things she saw and heard. She heard different surgeons in there talking about mistakes they were making in the surgery and how to change to a different part of the body to make up for it. And she heard the music that was playing during the operation. Now, there's no way she could have heard or seen these things if her brain was actually devoid of any oxygen and not having any electrical activity.
Well, when we spoke with her, she was quite annoyed that the music that they were playing was the
Yes.
Eagles song,
Yes.
Hotel California, with
Right.
the refrain, "You can check out anytime you want, but you can never leave."
That's right. That's right.
So, Dr. Grayson, there are a lot of skeptics, and I know that Dr. Larry Dawsey, who we interviewed, said, there are critics who wouldn't believe this even if it were true,
Right.
this being this kind of experience. How do you interact with the skeptics who say, I just cannot wrap my head around the possibility that the mind and the brain are not the same thing, and that people who are, in quotes, dead for 5, 10, 20 minutes by any objective standard could actually be observing something from afar?
Well, I understand that position because I started off as a skeptic, as a believer that the physical world was all that was. And I couldn't imagine how things like near-death experiences could have happened. But after my experience with that first patient and then subsequent patients, and reading the literature and interviewing other people who had near-death experiences, I decided that this was just too much evidence to just wish away. Now, you say that there are skeptics who are dismissing this. They are not skeptics. A skeptic is someone who reserves judgment until all the data are in. These people are diehard believers in a materialist philosophy, which is not being skeptical. Being skeptical is being open to evidence and being prepared to change your mind if the evidence changes.
Dr. Grayson, the stories that you have just been telling us bring up the question, does consciousness continue after brain activity stops? And it does relate to this question of skepticism and materialism, because many neuroscientists believe that the brain generates consciousness. I mean, we can't explain consciousness, so we really don't know that much about it. But
Sure.
But that's their stance, is the brain generates it. So if the brain isn't functioning, how can consciousness continue?
Well, that's the major question here, because obviously in daily life, it seems as if the brain and the mind are the same thing. When you get intoxicated, you don't think very well. When you get hit in the head or have a stroke, that affects your thinking. So it seems as if the mind is totally dependent on the brain, if not being actually what the brain does. But in extreme circumstances, like near-death experiences, when the brain is not functioning, the mind seems to dissociate from the brain and function without the effect of the brain. And this happens not only in near-death experiences, but other extreme situations as well. For example, there's a situation called terminal lucidity, in which people who have end-stage dementia, who have not been able to recognize family for years or to be able to speak, suddenly become completely lucid in the hours or sometimes days before they die. And when their family sees the patient suddenly recognize them and converse coherently, they think, oh, he's recovering. But actually it doesn't happen. He goes on to die very soon after that. And we have absolutely no explanation for how that can be. The brain does not regenerate itself. We also have research from a variety of labs in the last decade doing neuroimaging of people with psychedelic drugs. We used to think that these drugs operate by stimulating the brain to produce hallucinations. But what these studies have done, both in the UK and in the US, they've shown that the more elaborate the experience with a psychedelic drug, the less brain activity there is. The brain activity gets much calmer, much quieter, and much dim. And the connection between the different parts of the brain seems to be less and less. So these seem to argue that in extreme situations, the mind can function quite well without the brain. We don't know how that can happen, but on the other hand, we don't have any idea how a brain can produce a thought, how a physical process, electrical or chemical, produce a non-physical thing like a thought. We have no idea.
Well, you actually talk a bit in your book about the brain being a filter.
Yes.
Could you explain what you mean?
Sure. This theory goes back at least 2,000 years. Hippocrates wrote about the brain being the messenger or interpreter of our minds. And it's been a sort of a minority opinion among neuroscientists for centuries now. And an example might be a cell phone. The cell phone receives radio waves and filters out all the irrelevant frequencies and converts them into signals that you can hear. So when I talk to you and you hear me on your cell phone, if your cell phone battery goes dead, you can't hear me anymore, but my voice is still there. And the idea is that the brain is like a filter or receiver for the thoughts. And when the brain goes down, it stops filtering out the irrelevant material from the mind. What is this material? Basically, the brain evolved to help us negotiate within the physical world. So it lets in those things that are important to finding food and shelter and a mate and so forth to live in the world. It filters out irrelevant things such as deceased loved ones, sort of an otherworldly thing that don't involve the physical world. It makes sense. All of our senses filter out irrelevant input. Our eyes let in only certain wavelengths, and it filters out all the others, and our ears let only certain frequencies in. Other animals hear things we don't because they're not important to us. So it's plausible that the brain may have also evolved to filter out irrelevant thoughts and only let in those that are relevant to us, our survival.
Now, Dr. Grayson, I wonder if you could go back for listeners who have just recently joined us and describe the near-death experience again, what the commonalities are, and also talk a bit about the subjective aspects to it, and in particular, the colors. You've interviewed over 1,000 people, and it seems like a lot of these stories have color as a prominent feature.
Well, a near-death experience is a profound subjective experience that many people have when they are in a near-death situation or, in fact, pronounced dead. And people often report leaving their bodies, contacting people who are not physically present. They may be deceased loved ones or what appear to be deities. And they seem to exist in a non-physical world, not the earthly world we know, in another realm. Their thinking and perception, even though they don't have a brain anymore, are vivid, and the thinking is clearer and faster than ever, and their perceptions are extremely vivid. They often report seeing colors they had never seen in their earthly life, hearing sounds they had never heard before. Now, we have to take this with a grain of salt because when they come back into their bodies and tell us about this, they often say, well, words can't express what happened to me. And then we, of course, excitedly say, well, tell me about it. And, of course, they can't accurately. So we know that when we make them tell us about the experience, we're making them distort it and put it in words we can understand. So when they say, I saw these amazing colors, well, they didn't have eyes, so they obviously weren't seeing the way we're seeing. And it's not clear what a color is in that other realm.
Right.
But when they're back talking to us, they have to use those words to explain what they experienced.
You're listening to Dr. Bruce Grayson. He's Professor Emeritus of Psychiatry and Neurobehavioral Sciences at the University of Virginia School of Medicine. He's a Distinguished Life Fellow of the American Psychiatric Association. His new book is titled After. A doctor explores what near-death experiences reveal about life and beyond.
After the break, how many people have near-death experiences when they're in a life-threatening situation?
Do some people report frightening or negative experiences?
Sometimes people die and are revived inexplicably. What do they tell us?
How does culture influence people's experience between death and revival?
We'll hear a story that might convince you these perceptions are real.
You're listening to The People's Pharmacy with Joe and Terry Graydon. This podcast is brought to you by the Verizana Health Club. This comprehensive home testing service enables you to track crucial health markers of gut health, inflammation, metabolism, hormones, thyroid function, and many other organ systems. Regular testing can help detect health imbalances before they lead to sickness. online at Verisana, verisana.com/health-club. Get 50% off the first month with the discount code PEOPLE50.
Welcome back to the People's Pharmacy. I'm Joe Graydon.
And I'm Terry Graydon.
The People's Pharmacy is brought to you in part by Cocoa Via Memory Plus, a supplement with 750 milligrams of cocoa flavonols, the plant-based nutrients from fresh cocoa that help support memory. More information at cocovia.com.
Also by Verisana, an analytical laboratory providing home health tests for hormones, gut health, and the microbiome. Now with an annual health club plan. Online at verisana.com.
Why do near-death experiences bring about such a sudden and lifelong transformation?
We're talking with Dr. Bruce Greyson. He's Professor Emeritus of Psychiatry and Neurobehavioral Sciences at the University of Virginia School of Medicine. His award-winning research led him to become a Distinguished Life Fellow of the American Psychiatric Association. He's author of the new book, After, A Doctor Explores What Near-Death Experiences Reveal About Life and Beyond.
Dr. Greyson, how many people experience a near-death experience, an NDE, and how many people don't? In other words, how common is this, and does it have anything to do with living a quote-unquote good life? And do people who quote-unquote live a bad life not experience a near-death experience?
That's a great question, Joe. The data that we have suggests that about 10 to 20% of people whose hearts stop will report to us a near-death experience. Now, that suggests that 80 to 90% do not. But what it really means is that 80 to 90% either do not remember it or do not choose to tell us about it or didn't have one. So we know that we can count on getting reports from 10 to 20%, but we don't know how frequent they occur when we don't hear reports. As for the type of person who has a near-death experience, we have not found any way to predict who's going to have one and who's not going to have one, or what kind they're going to have. We've heard near-death experiences from people of all races, of both genders, from all different cultures, and people who lead apparently exemplary lives and people who have been convicted of murder.
Dr. Greyson, you mentioned what kind of experience, and in your book, After, you do say that although most people who report their near-death experiences are reporting a very positive experience, very uplifting, some people don't have a great near-death experience. In fact, it's pretty unsettling. Can you tell us a little bit about that, please?
Sure. There are a small number of unpleasant near-death experiences. Again, we don't know with any confidence how many, because these experiences are often very hard for people to talk about. So most studies who have tried to put an estimate on this come up with a figure of between 1% and 5% of near-death experiences being unpleasant. I suspect that's an underestimate, because I think there are a lot of people who aren't willing to talk about these experiences. What we found is that there are different types of unpleasant experience. There are some that have blatantly hellish imagery, fire and brimstone and demons. And that's by far the smallest category. And I've only heard that from people who had been raised in a culture that believed in such a thing, such as Roman Catholics or fundamentalist Protestants. I've never heard that from someone who wasn't raised to believe in that type of a hell. There's another large category of unpleasant experiences that include people who just find themselves in a featureless black void with no sound, no sight, nothing, just their consciousness and nothing else for eternity, which is quite terrifying for Americans. However, I've talked to a few people who were raised in a Hindu culture who had such an experience and experienced it as blissful. They think this is nirvana, and it's the same phenomenology, but they experience it differently than Americans do. But the
So the experience may be similar, but the interpretation is quite different.
Exactly. But the largest group of unpleasant experiences are just like the pleasant ones in terms of what they experience, but they're experienced in an unpleasant way. For example, they may feel themselves being hurtled down a tunnel at tremendous speed and confronted by a blinding light, and they're terrified of this. And they usually try to fight against it and try to get back into their bodies. And at some point, they may get exhausted and give up. And at that point, as soon as they give up, it becomes a blissful experience. And the way I understand this as a psychiatrist is that losing control, which invariably happens during a near-death experience, can be quite terrifying for people for whom it's very important to remain in control. And it's this loss of control that's the terrifying part of the experience. And as soon as they give up trying to be in control, it becomes a blissful experience.
Dr. Grayson, we've talked a lot about near-death experiences, NDEs, but what about death experiences? And what I mean by that is, are there any stories of people who, for example, have drowned and they're underwater for not 5 or 6 minutes, but 10 or 20 minutes? Are there stories about people who have had cardiac arrest not for 2 or 3 minutes, but again, for 10 or 20 minutes, which is incompatible with life, where everybody basically pronounced the person dead, and then inexplicably, they somehow managed to come back?
Yes, there are. One of the recent cases is that of Dr. Mary Neal, who was an orthopedic surgeon, who was kayaking in Chile and was caught. She went over a waterfall and was caught upside down underwater at the base of the waterfall for quite a long time. And was eventually rescued, and she had a very dramatic near-death experience. Another experience was one of George Rodinaya, who was a physicist in the USSR, who was killed in an automobile accident and pronounced dead and actually put in a morgue for several days. And then he was taken out in order to prepare him for burial. And at that point, he awoke and again described a blissful near-death experience. So we have these going back centuries, but it's only in recent years that we've been able to really document that they actually were, quote, dead for a long period of time, which of course raises the question of what does it mean to be dead? We used to think it was a concrete event. You're alive now, then you're dead. But resuscitation physicians now, such as Dr. Sam Parnia in New York, are looking at death more as a process that takes place over time, and gradually different parts of the body stop functioning at different rates. So that death is not a single event, but a process that takes time.
I wonder if you could describe or explain the light that people see in near-death experiences. It seems to be very common, but also somewhat culture-bound, that is to say, the tunnel that people go through.
Well, the light, I wish I could explain it. The light is something that is not perceived as just like a light bulb or the light from the sun, but people experience it as a living entity that kind of radiates unconditional love and sort of embraces them. And I don't know what to make of this. Many people interpret this as a deity. This is God. This is something else like that. Because of the way it makes them feel. The tunnel, I think that's a good illustration of the way culture affects what people describe. People all over the world will describe going through a long, dark, enclosed structure in order to get from this physical world to the other realm, whatever that is. And in the U.S. and other developed countries, we often use the term tunnel. But I've spoken to people from other cultures where there aren't a whole lot of tunnels, and they may say, I fell into a well, or I went into a cave, or I was in the calyx of a giant flower. One person I interviewed here in the U.S. who was a truck driver described it as getting sucked through a tailpipe. So your cultural background will determine how you describe these phenomena, but not the phenomena itself.
Well, part of the description that we have of people who have had near-death experiences is in artwork. Can you describe the artwork that some of your patients have created after a near-death experience?
Well, I can't. They do this because, as I said before, most of them say there are no words to express what happened to me. So they try to express it in other ways. And many turn to art, some turn to music. The artwork is of different types. Some look like paintings of real events where people try to describe in painting or in drawing themselves leaving their bodies, encountering other beings. Most resort to a more abstract representation in which they can explain to you what's in there, but we don't see it unless it's being explained to us.
Dr. Grayson, one of the most striking features that you describe is how people change their way of living after they have survived dying. Can you tell us how a near-death experience tends to transform someone's life?
Sure. This is one of the most consistent aspects of the experience, and one of the most impressive to me as a psychiatrist, that they have a consistent pattern of after effects, which include becoming more spiritual, more interested in compassion and altruism, and much less concerned with material goods and competition and fame and prestige. It also makes them much less tolerant of violence. And this has profound effects on people whose lives were based in violence. For example, I spoke with one person, I knew him quite well, who had been a Marine in Vietnam. That had been his career goal. He had been a high school bully. He was a real macho guy, and eventually found the Marines and did very well there until he was shot in Vietnam and had bullet fragments all over his chest and his lungs. He had to be evacuated to a hospital in the Philippines where they operated on him. And during the operation, he left his body and had a beautiful near-death experience. And when he came back, he had this idea that he couldn't possibly tolerate violence anymore. He was a career Marine, though, so he did go back into the field and tried to lead his platoon and found that he just couldn't shoot his gun. So he ended up leaving the Marines to his great dismay and coming back to the States and actually retrained to be a medical technician. And I've heard this time and time again. Another friend of mine was a policeman who bled out during surgery and had a near-death experience, and again came back just horribly opposed to violence and to hurting other people. And he, too, tried to go back to his job as a policeman after he rehabbed and found he just couldn't shoot his gun. Ended up going back to school and trained to become a high school teacher. Another fellow I interviewed was a homeless drug addict who had repeated episodes with the police, and at one point had a cardiac arrest in jail from withdrawal. And he had, again, a beautiful near-death experience. And when I interviewed him first, it was about 30 years after that near-death experience, and he said he had not had a craving for a drug ever since that one event. And in fact, he at that time was counseling dying people in nursing homes. Now, I can say that as a psychiatrist, I started getting concerned about what this does to people who are suicidal, because one of the most profound after effects is that people lose their fear of death. And I know that being afraid of what happens after you die is one thing that stops people from becoming suicidal. So I did a study of people who made suicide attempts and then had a near-death experience as a result of that, and compared those to people who did not have near-death experiences after the suicide attempt. And what I found was that those who had near-death experiences were much less suicidal afterwards than those who didn't have near-death experiences.
Fascinating.
Dr. Grayson, a lot of the near-death experiencers describe a life review.
Yes.
And I would be very interested in how often that occurs and what the nature of that life review may be. We once interviewed a fellow who was also in the military, who was also a schoolyard bully, who was dead for quite a while.
He had been struck by lightning.
And what he said was, that was so painful because not only did I experience the pain that I had inflicted on the individual, but I also experienced the pain that that person's death caused friends and family members. He said, I never wanted to go through that again. I changed my life, and I became very actively involved in hospice and just being with people before they died after this experience. So can you tell us a little bit more about that life review?
Sure. About a third of people who have near-death experiences also report reviewing their entire lives. And in some of those, they experience their events in their lives not only from their own perspective, but from those of other people involved. And that can be quite eye-opening for many of them. For example, one fellow, Tom Sawyer, that was his real name, he had a near-death experience when he was about 30, when a truck he was working on came down and crushed his chest. And he reviewed his life, and one incident that was most vivid for him was when he was 17 years old, and an impulsive hot rodder, he was driving his new truck down the street, and a drunk man ran out in front of him and almost hit him. He stopped his truck, rolled down the window, and started shouting at the guy. Well, the fellow, being drunk, reached his hand in the truck window and slapped Tom across the face. That was too much for this hot-headed teenager, so he got out of the truck and started beating this poor drunk man to a pulp and left him unconscious on the median strip. Well, when he had the near-death experience, he relived this event not only from his own perspective, but also through the eyes of the man he had beaten up. And he experienced seeing Tom's face turning red and seeing these fists come at him, and then felt each one of the 32 blows on his face and his chest, felt his nose getting bloodied, felt his teeth going through his lower lip, and felt everything, the humiliation, the embarrassment from through the eyes of his victim, as well as through his own eyes at the same time. And that was quite startling for him. It made him really realize that we are not separate beings, but we are all part of the same thing. And what you do to somebody else, you're really doing to yourself as well. Now, sometimes this has very therapeutic aspects to it. Another person, Barbara Harris Whitfield, had an experience where she, in her near-death experience, she went back and relived the childhood abuse she had at the hands of her mother. And then she started reviewing the same thing through the eyes of her mother and realized that her mother, who had also been abused as a child, was sort of repeating the same thing that had happened to her, and felt she had no option, no other skills. And Barbara came away from this experience with an increased understanding and compassion for her mother.
So how do these life reviews impact people once they come back from their near-death experience?
It gives them a new perspective on the meaning of things in their lives. They see things from a different perspective now and realize what things are important in life, what things make life meaningful and fulfilling, and what things are totally trivial. One physician, he's actually a fellow psychiatrist here in Charlottesville, George Ritchie, described his near-death experience, and he said, in my life review, I didn't see anything that I thought was important before this. I expected, getting my Eagle badge and Boy Scouts, things like that would be the important things I'd see. And none of those things made any sense in the near-death experience. What his near-death experience was like in the life review was all the times when he had been helpful to people or harmful to people. It involved his relationships and how he got along with other people, not his physical accomplishments. So people come back from the near-death experience seeing that the life review has taught them a different way of looking at what's important in life and what is not, and how they relate to the world around them.
Can you possibly take one of these people and show us how they related differently after their near-death experience? Did the woman who realized why her mother treated her so badly change the way in which she interacted?
Yes. Unfortunately, her mother had passed away by this time. But she says that it really changed the way she related to her own children. She had 3 children at the time. And she was determined then not to repeat this pattern that had gone through her family for generations. And there are many other examples of people who came back with a new understanding and just totally changed their lives.
I wonder if you could tell us briefly about Dr. Eben Alexander's story, because there are a lot of skeptics who go, well, his medical records couldn't possibly correlate with his story, and yet you found a couple of colleagues who were willing to review those medical records. What happened to Dr. Alexander?
Eben Alexander was a middle-aged neurosurgeon who had a very rare bacterial infection in his brain. And he woke up one morning with a splitting headache, and within a matter of an hour or two had become completely unconscious. His wife called the rescue squad. He was taken to the hospital. He started seizing in the rescue squad vehicle. And when he was admitted to the hospital, he was basically in a coma. He was seizing. They gave him medications to stop the seizures. And he was in a coma for about 6 days before he finally awoke. Now, this infection he had was extremely rare and has a 1% survival rate in adults. And most of those who survive have irreversible brain damage and can never really function independently on their own. So they didn't have much hope for him. And yet, a few months after he awoke from this coma, he was functioning fully again, able to converse, able to do everything he could do beforehand. Now, he had, during this coma of 6 days, a very elaborate near-death experience in which he claimed to have left his body and going to another realm where he saw beautiful beings, and he described them in very earthly terms of gardens and flowers and butterflies. And at one point, he described a sort of a guide, a beautiful woman who accompanied him on the wing of a giant butterfly and didn't speak to him, but conveyed to him that he was unconditionally loved. He had never seen this woman before, but he had a vivid images in his mind of who she was. Now, it turns out that Eben Alexander had been adopted at birth by his parents, and he had made contact with his birth family, and he discovered that they went on to have other children, one of whom was a woman who had died in a car accident about 10 years before his near-death experience. And when he was shown a picture of this woman, he recognized her as the woman who was on the butterfly wing in his near-death experience. Now, many people who have heard this story poo-pooed the whole thing and said that this could not possibly be. He had to be hallucinating or making the whole thing up. And there were actually some articles written about how he just made this whole story up and it couldn't possibly be true. So I read his story and I read the critiques of it. And I decided the only way to really get to the bottom of this was to actually look at the medical records and see what was going on with him at the time. So with his permission, I got the medical records from the hospital, which were more than 600 pages long because he had been there for a whole week, actually. And I gave copies of these to 2 other colleagues, and each of the 3 of us independently went through the 600 pages of his medical record and drew conclusions as to what was going on with him at different times. And then we agreed to get back together and iron out the incompatibilities between our conclusions. And what happened was there was no inconsistency at all. We all agreed conclusively that he had been as close to death as you can be, with virtually no brain function. The CAT scans in his medical record clearly showed no structure to his brain at all. The brain cavity was completely filled up with pus, eliminating any of the sutures in the brain. And there was virtually no way he could have had any brain function at all during that time. And in fact, the medical record also showed that they were doing what's called the Glasgow Coma Scale, measuring his brain function several times a day for the entire week. And at no point did he have a Glasgow Coma score consistent with normal functioning. Now, during the time that he had this near-death experience, he described several things going on in the hospital as well, including one episode where there were several people around his bed, and he described who they were and where they were standing. And this would be very unexpected because generally when you're in the ICU, which he was in the intensive care unit, no one is allowed in except for one or two family members. And this was a whole group of people who were not related to him. And it turned out that his wife, since she was so desperate, had called together a group of friends to have a prayer circle around his bed. And she confirmed that the people who were there were the ones that Eben had identified in his near-death experience, standing just where they were standing in his NDE. And this happened at a time when we know from the Glasgow Coma Scale that he had virtually no brain function. So there's no way he could have known about these things. And we eventually published this conclusion in the Journal of Near-Death Studies.
Dr. Grayson, it seems as if you've described how people have these experiences, but they have a great deal of difficulty describing what happened to them. They say that they have no words or even concepts to describe the near-death experience. You talk about a woman by the name of Lynn. She was 21 years old. She was on a bicycle, and she was hit by a drunk driver head on, and he had apparently run a red light. And when she tried to describe what happened to her, she said, "I can't compare it to Earth things. It's like trying to discuss DNA with an infant."
Right. I have heard this from so many near-death experiencers. They say that when I was in the near-death experience, everything made perfect sense to me. But now that I'm back here in my body, in my brain, I can't make sense of it. They say things like, I feel like I'm an ant inside an ant farm. I can't understand what's going on around me. And for that reason, many of them resort to describing it in artwork or in music because they just can't find words for it. One example is this is the way almost every near-death experiencer says there was no time in the other realm, that time did not exist. Everything was happening at once or just was there was just everything was in eternity. And yet, when they describe to me the NDE, they describe it as if it's a sequence of events. This happened, then that happened, and then that happened. So when I ask them, how do you make sense of this? If there was no time, how can there be a sequence? And they say, I can't explain it. Over there was no paradox at all. It was just happening, everything at once. But here, when I try to explain it, it sounds like a paradox, but it wasn't over there. And one person after another has told me that things that were crystal clear in the NDE just can't be understood here in this earth world.
Oh, I found it fascinating that some say it's realer than real.
Almost everyone who's had a near-death experience has said it was realer than real. Jeffrey Long, in one of his many books about near-death experiences, claimed that 93% of them said it was realer than real, and we have found similar results in our data. And they say that, when I talk to people about their NDE, they say talking to God in my near-death experience was more real to me than talking to you right now. So I'm not sure what that means, what realer than real means, but they're pretty consistent in saying that.
Dr. Grayson, I know that we have heard the term near-death experience for a couple of decades now, partly because of Dr. Raymond Moody's book, but partly because it's been in the popular culture.
Sure.
And I think a lot of the doubters, skeptics, people who say, this is all imaginary, it couldn't have really happened the way people describe it. They are basically, now that they know about this thing called a near-death experience, they have these expectations. And so as a result, they're just reflecting what they've heard about after they have this kind of encounter. It didn't really happen. They're just fantasizing. They're just making it up. I wonder if you could perhaps describe a story in your book about a fellow in South Africa, Jack Bybee, and why you think that experience may be a kind of confirmation that near-death experiences are real.
Well, sure, I can talk about Jack's experience, but let me first say that This seemed to us to be a perfectly reasonable hypothesis, so we did some research to study it. And we actually had been collecting what we now call near-death experiences for a decade or two before Moody wrote his book, using the term near-death experience and telling us what we're supposed to experience in it. So we went back to those early files from the 1960s and selected 24 cases for which we had the most detail and compared those to cases that we had collected in recent years of near-death experiences. And we looked at all the features that Raymond Moody had described in his book in 1975 and compared the frequency in cases we collected in the 1960s and today. And we found absolutely no difference. So people described the same type of near-death experience before Moody's book told us what to expect. We also have lots of accounts from people who had experiences directly contradicting their preconceived beliefs. For example, from several atheists who encountered deities who were totally shocked by that. Cases like Jack Bybee, whom you mentioned, give us other evidence that these are not just expectation. Jack was a 25-year-old technical writer. He was actually living in South Africa at the time, who had been hospitalized for severe pneumonia, and he had repeated respiratory arrest where he just couldn't breathe anymore. And he had befriended one particular nurse, a young nurse named Anita, who used to flirt with him, he thought. And one day she told him that she was going to be away for the long weekend, and she wouldn't see him for a while. So he wished her well, and she went off. And after she left, he had another respiratory arrest where he had to be resuscitated. And during that time, when he wasn't breathing, he had a dramatic near-death experience and found himself in some lush landscape, and he was startled to see Anita walking towards him. So he said to her, "Anita, what are you doing here?" And she explained to him that she was there and he could not stay, had to go back. And she wanted him to tell her parents that she loved them very much and she was sorry that she wrecked the red MGB. And then she turned and walked away. He later recovered in his body and remembered in detail the near-death experience and told the first nurse he saw, who then started to cry and ran out of the room. He later found out that, in fact, the reason Anita had taken the weekend off was that it was her 21st birthday, and her parents were coming down from the country to visit her. And they surprised her with a red MGB for her birthday, which Jack tells me was very rare in South Africa in those days. Well, she got so excited to get this red MGB that she jumped into it and sped off down a hill, lost control of the car, and crashed into a telephone pole, dying instantly. And this was shortly before Jack's near-death experience. So he was not expecting to see her because he had no idea of that she was dead. And he certainly had no way of knowing how she died. So this is one of many cases like this in which someone had contact with someone who has died, but who is not known to have died, which kind of eliminates the possibility of expectation or wishful thinking.
Dr. Grayson, we are almost at the end of our time with you. So I'm wondering if you can give us some idea, what do near-death experiences mean for those of us who have not had one?
Well, I think if you read enough near-death experiences and try to absorb the lessons from them, you can't help feeling less frightened about death and dying. Because no matter what people describe in their near-death experiences, they almost universally say that death is not something to be feared. And that can have a profound effect on how we lead our lives, because the fear of dying often leads to fear of living fully, of taking risks, because we don't want to risk losing what we have. And what they're telling us is that there's nothing to lose, that what happens after death is just as good or even better than what we have here. Near-death experiences also come back by basically affirming the golden rule that we are all in this together and that you should treat other people the way you want to be treated, that what you do to someone else, you're actually doing to yourself as well. And they often describe it as looking at a hand. If you just look at the fingers of your hand, it looks like they're separate entities. But if you look at the whole hand, you see they're all interconnected. And that's the way we all are, they say. And if you accept this, which is basically one of the tenets of almost every religion we have, then you must think that things like competition and hurting other people to get ahead just make no sense. And that the way to live a decent life is to be kind and generous and compassionate.
And that certainly would make things a better world right here and now. Dr. Bruce Grayson, thank you so much for talking with us on the People's Pharmacy today.
Well, thank you, Joe and Terry. I've enjoyed this.
You've been listening to Dr. Bruce Grayson. He's Professor Emeritus of Psychiatry and Neurobehavioral Sciences at the University of Virginia School of Medicine. Dr. Grayson is a Distinguished Life Fellow of the American Psychiatric Association and the author of After, A Doctor Explores What Near-Death Experiences Reveal About Life and Beyond. It's the culmination of nearly half a century of Dr. Grayson's scientific research.
Lynn Siegel produced today's show. Al Wodarski engineered. Dave Graydon edits our interviews. B.J. Liederman composed our theme music.
The People's Pharmacy is a co-production of North Carolina Public Radio, WUNC.
To buy a CD of today's show or any other People's Pharmacy episode, you can call 800-732-2334. Today's show is number 1249. The number again, 800-732-2334, on the web at peoplespharmacy.com.
When you visit the website, you can share your thoughts about today's show. Have you had a near-death experience? Or talk to someone else who has? We're interested in learning about it.
You can subscribe to our podcast through your favorite podcast provider. We post the show on our website every Monday morning. You might want to share it with a friend. Not all of our interview with Dr. Grayson fit in this broadcast, but we're including it in the podcast this week.
At our website, you can sign up for our free online newsletter to get the latest news about COVID-19 and other important health stories. By subscribing to our newsletter, you also have regular access to our weekly podcasts, including our extended interview with Dr. Grayson.
In Durham, North Carolina, I'm Joe Graydon.
And I'm Terry Graydon. Thank you for listening. Please join us again next week.